It was sometime after midnight when I found myself driving alone through a long and desolate stretch of highway in central Montana, a part of the state where the landscape flattens into vast fields and low hills that seem to stretch endlessly into the dark. The only illumination came from the high beams of my car slicing through the night, revealing occasional signs for exits that led to places too small to show up on a map and too quiet to make any impression on passing travelers. I had been on the road for hours, pushing through the fatigue that always sets in during the late hours when the mind becomes quiet and the darkness begins to play tricks on your perception. My fuel gauge had dropped lower than I would have liked, something I hadn't fully noticed until it was teetering just above empty. And I had little choice but to exit the highway at the next available sign that indicated a gas station was nearby. Even though the road it led me down was narrow, unmarked, and unlit, surrounded by silhouettes of trees and fields under a moonless sky. After several minutes of driving down that lonely road, I eventually came upon a small, isolated gas station that looked as if it hadn't been updated in decades. There were just 2 pumps in front of a squat, rectangular building with faded siding and fluorescent lights above the pumps that buzzed and flickered with a sickly, intermittent glow, casting an uneven pool of light over the cracked concrete lot. The convenience store appeared to be closed for the night, or at least unattended, with dark windows and a locked door. And the entire place radiated a sense of abandonment that made me question whether it was even safe to stop. But I was running on fumes, and I had no other option. I pulled up to the pump closest to the building, got out of the car, and began fueling, trying to stay alert while the cool night air pressed in all around me. There was no movement anywhere nearby, no passing vehicles, no voices, no signs of life. The only sound was the steady mechanical click of the pump and the dull rhythmic humming of the overhead lights, which gave the entire station an eerie and surreal atmosphere, like I had wandered into a forgotten pocket of the world that time had left behind. A few minutes into the fueling process, just as I was starting to feel slightly more at ease, I noticed a vehicle approaching slowly from the far end of the lot. It was a dark-colored SUV, older in make, possibly from the late 1990s or early 2000s, with a dull, matte finish that reflected very little of the station's weak lighting. The SUV did not pull up to a pump, nor did it stop near the store entrance. Instead, it coasted in silently with its headlights turned off, and came to a rest at an odd angle along the edge of the lot, partially concealed in shadow. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, but something about its deliberate movement and unusual positioning raised my suspicions. As the vehicle settled into place, I happened to glance toward its rear and immediately noticed something that made my stomach tighten with unease. There were no license plates, none on the front and none on the back. The SUV bore no visible registration of any kind, just a smooth, unbroken surface where identifying tags should have been. That single detail, simple as it was, shifted my mindset from cautious to alert, because in my experience, vehicles without plates at this time of night, in this kind of location, almost never meant anything good. 2 men exited the SUV shortly after it came to a stop. They moved with a kind of quiet intention that felt rehearsed rather than casual, as if they already knew what they were going to do before they stepped out of the vehicle. Both were of average build and height, probably somewhere in their late 30s or early 40s. And while their clothing was unremarkable, dark jackets, worn jeans, and low baseball caps pulled slightly forward, their overall demeanor felt off. They didn't exhibit the distracted or tired body language of fellow travelers or locals simply stopping for fuel. They didn't glance around the lot, look at the pumps, or make any move toward the store. Instead, both of them looked directly at me, and without speaking to one another, they began walking straight toward my car. Their approach was slow but steady, not aggressive but far too focused to be casual. And as they crossed the distance between us, I noticed that one of them was holding a small object in his hand. Something metallic that reflected the harsh light from above. When they were within a few feet of my vehicle, the man in front raised his hand slightly and extended the object toward me, as if offering it, all the while maintaining a completely neutral expression on his face. The item he held out appeared to be a keychain, or perhaps some sort of small tool. Nothing instantly recognizable or clearly useful. Just a piece of metal that didn't belong to me and had no reason to be in my possession. I stood there for a moment, processing the situation. And while the man didn't speak in that moment, his gesture made it clear he was suggesting that I had dropped the object, even though I hadn't removed anything from my pockets, hadn't opened the trunk, and hadn't so much as left the vehicle for more than the few steps to pump gas. The entire premise of the encounter was flawed, and it took everything in me not to show how unsettled I was. I shook my head once and took a step back, signaling that whatever he was holding wasn't mine. And while neither of them reacted overtly, they didn't retreat either. They remained exactly where they were, close enough to my car to cause discomfort, yet still silent and motionless, as though waiting for a different response. The sense of pressure was immediate and overwhelming, and my instincts, which I've learned never to ignore, screamed that this was not an innocent interaction. The pump clicked off with a mechanical finality that cut through the tension like a gunshot. I replaced the nozzle, got into the car, locked the doors without hesitation, and drove off without saying another word or looking directly at them again. As I pulled away, I could see in the mirror that they hadn't moved. They were still standing near the vehicle, facing in my direction, but making no visible attempt to return to their SUV or to leave the lot. About half an hour later, after putting some serious distance between myself and that gas station, I finally merged back onto the highway, letting the steady rhythm of the road ease some of the tension in my chest. At that point, I tried to tell myself that maybe it had all just been a weird misunderstanding. Creepy, sure, but nothing that actually crossed the line into dangerous. Maybe I was just overtired, my mind playing tricks after too many miles and too little sleep. But then, as the highway curved through a wooded stretch with no streetlights and barely any traffic, my headlights caught a shape up ahead on the shoulder of the road. It was subtle, set just beyond the guardrail, angled slightly like it had pulled over intentionally but wasn't in distress. As I got closer, that uneasy feeling in my gut returned full force. It was the same SUV. No lights, no movement, no visible occupants, but I recognized the dark silhouette, the outline of the roof rack, the same dull, unwashed surface, catching just enough reflection to confirm what I didn't want to believe. It hadn't passed me on the highway. I never saw it pull out of the lot, which meant, somehow, it had gotten ahead of me. I didn't slow down. I didn't look over. I kept my speed steady, hands locked tight on the wheel, eyes fixed on the stretch of road in front of me like it was the only thing that mattered. I didn't know if they were watching or waiting, or maybe just trying to scare me. But whatever the intent was, I wasn't going to give them an opportunity to do anything more. After another hour of driving with nothing but my high beams and the occasional semi-truck passing in the opposite direction, I finally reached a town big enough to have a well-lit gas station and a 24-hour diner. I pulled in, parked near the front where there were cameras and a clerk behind the counter, and stayed there for the better part of an hour just to regroup. I watched every car that came and went, but the SUV never showed again. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even report? 2 men who gave me a bad feeling? A car without plates parked in the woods? They hadn't said anything threatening, hadn't touched me or my vehicle. I knew how it would sound, like a traveler spooked by a late-night coincidence. So I let it go, at least on paper. But I never forgot it. Since then, I've made a few rules for myself. I never let my tank get below half when driving through remote areas. I don't stop at back road stations late at night, no matter how tired I am. And if something feels wrong, even if I can't explain why, I leave immediately. Because whatever that was back there, it wasn't just strange, it was intentional. And if I'd lingered, I'm not sure I'd be here telling the story. In the autumn of 2020, during a solo cross-country drive from Atlanta to Dallas, I found myself passing through the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, sometime after midnight, when the road had quieted to the point where even the low hum of the tires over the pavement seemed too loud against the otherwise profound silence. The kind of silence that stretches between towns late at night and makes every sound feel isolated. Headlights reflecting back at you from road signs, the occasional buzz of overhead wires, and the constant presence of your own heartbeat just below it all. Though I had originally planned to drive another hour or 2 before stopping, fatigue had begun to wear at me in the way it does when the monotony of night driving starts to dull your senses and make the darkness seem heavier than it really is. Wanting to give my eyes a break and refill the gas tank while I still had a decent signal, I exited the interstate at the next available ramp that advertised fuel. The exit led me onto a narrow 2-lane road lined with darkened tree lines and barely marked turns. And after a short drive through what felt like complete isolation, I came upon a small, unbranded gas station that appeared at first glance to have been left behind by time and commerce alike. The building was a squat, single-story structure made of aged brick, its roof flat and patched in places with what looked like black tar paper. And its exterior lighting consisted of a single, buzzing floodlight that hung loosely over 2 weathered pumps. Though it was the only sign of life I had seen for miles, the station looked operational in the technical sense, though not exactly welcoming. The signage was faded and partially obscured by grime and torn posters advertising soft drinks long out of rotation. And there were no visible security cameras or signage indicating 24-hour service. Just a flickering, open light in the window that seemed more like a question than a confirmation. As I pulled into the lot and parked by the pumps, I left the engine running for a moment, debating whether to continue on or stop, but eventually shut it off and stepped out into the cool night air, which was still and oddly dense, with the smell of old asphalt, fuel, and something faintly metallic. I made my way toward the entrance, and as I opened the creaking glass door, I was greeted not by sound or music, but by a sudden drop in temperature and the faint, lingering scent of cleaning chemicals that failed to mask the scent of something older and more sour beneath the surface. Inside, the store was dimly lit, with about half of its overhead fluorescents functioning properly, casting long, flickering shadows across dusty shelves that held a sparse and seemingly random collection of snacks, off-brand motor oil, expired-looking candy bars, and beverage coolers that hummed loudly against the silence, as if protesting their continued operation. The air felt stagnant, and the space itself seemed to exhale a kind of stillness that made me instantly aware of how alone I was. Behind the counter stood a man who appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s, with a frame that was tall but somewhat slack with age, and features that were hard to place. Thin, pale skin stretched across high cheekbones, deep-set eyes that seemed a little too unfocused, and long, thinning hair pulled back into a dull gray ponytail. His clothing was layered in a way that didn't quite match the season. A flannel shirt under a light jacket that looked well worn but not dirty, as though it had been worn every day for years without ever really being washed or replaced. He didn't speak right away, nor did he acknowledge me with any kind of greeting, but rather looked up slowly from behind the register and regarded me with a neutral expression that lacked both curiosity and warmth. His eyes resting on mine for a fraction longer than what would typically be considered polite, before shifting briefly toward the window and then back again, as though mentally cataloging my arrival. I told him I wanted to fill up the tank and handed him a 20, which he took without a word. He processed the transaction in silence, then handed back the change while briefly glancing through the window at my car, and after a beat of silence, just enough for it to feel deliberate, he mentioned that I might want to check the rear tire on the driver's side before I got back on the road, because to him, it looked like the belt might be starting to separate inside the rubber, which could eventually cause a blowout. He said it without any trace of urgency or concern, as if reciting a line he had delivered many times before. And although the specificity of the comment gave me pause, I couldn't see how he would have known anything about the condition of that tire, especially since it wasn't visibly damaged or deflated in any way. The car had driven smoothly the entire trip, and I hadn't noticed any unusual vibrations, noises, or performance issues that would suggest a tire problem. But something about the way he said it made the words stick in my mind, even as I nodded without replying and walked back outside. As I stepped off the curb and back into the lot, I noticed something I had somehow missed on the way in. Parked along the side of the building, partially obscured by shadow and positioned at an awkward angle, was a dark SUV that didn't appear to be actively refueling or servicing the station in any way. It was facing away from the pumps, headlights off, and tucked just enough into the shadow cast by the edge of the lot that I hadn't seen it from the pump when I first arrived. There were no visible occupants, but the windows were tinted dark enough that it was impossible to tell if anyone was inside without walking up to it, which I had no intention of doing. I returned to the car, checked the tire in question with a flashlight, and found no obvious signs of damage. The tread looked worn, but intact, and there were no bulges or cracks visible to the naked eye. Still, I made a mental note to have it checked properly at the next larger stop, if only to ease the growing sense of unease that had begun to settle in the back of my mind. I started the engine and pulled away, glancing one last time at the shadowed SUV as I exited the lot and rejoined the highway, silently hoping the strange comment and the strange vehicle were unrelated, but already suspecting they weren't. Roughly 10 minutes after merging back onto the interstate, I began to notice a set of headlights behind me. Not close enough to cause immediate concern, but too consistently present to ignore. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just another late-night traveler on a quiet stretch of highway. But as I drove, I realized the vehicle behind me wasn't just sharing the road. It was shadowing me. Every slight change in speed, every lane shift, every gentle deceleration or acceleration I made, it followed suit, keeping the exact same distance with unsettling precision. as if it had tethered itself invisibly to my back bumper. There was nothing erratic about its behavior, which somehow made it more unnerving. It wasn't tailgating or flashing its lights. It didn't pass or fall back. It simply stayed, persistent and patient, like it had all the time in the world. I experimented, dropped 5 miles per hour below the speed limit, then crept back up. And each time, the SUV responded in kind. I began to feel the walls of the highway close in around me. The empty space between towns stretched thinner than I remembered. The exits fewer and farther apart than seemed fair. When the next rest stop finally appeared on a blue sign glowing in my headlights, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't just a pull-off. It was lit up like a stadium, a rare and welcome island of brightness in the vast, dark quiet. I eased off the ramp and into the parking lot, choosing a space near the vending machines under a floodlight that buzzed faintly overhead. I killed the engine but kept my hands on the steering wheel, watching the road where I had just exited, waiting to see if the SUV would follow me in. It didn't. But it didn't drive past either, not right away. Instead, it slowed to a crawl near the exit ramp, hovering there at the edge of the light's reach, just outside the rest area entrance, as if the driver were trying to make up their mind. I sat frozen, engine off, staring at the shape in my side mirror, my mind racing through every possibility. Maybe they were lost. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe none of this meant anything. But as the seconds ticked by, 5, maybe 6, though they felt much longer, the vehicle simply waited. Then, without turning in or accelerating away quickly, it slipped back onto the interstate and faded into the darkness. I stayed parked for a long time after that, long enough to see 2 more cars come and go, long enough to finish a bottle of warm water and feel the tightness in my chest finally start to unwind. I debated calling someone, not the police exactly, but someone local, someone who might know if the gas station had a reputation. I thought about going back and trying to confront the attendant to ask what he meant when he brought up my tire. That strange, almost clinical observation he made about something he shouldn't have been able to see. But the truth was, I didn't want to drive that road again. And I wasn't sure what I would even report. Nothing had happened. Nothing tangible, just unease. Prolonged, persistent unease. To this day, I don't know if the man at the gas station was involved or if he was simply a strange personality I crossed paths with during a moment of heightened sensitivity. Maybe he knew something. Or maybe he was just playing a game he didn't expect me to take seriously. Maybe the SUV had nothing to do with him. Or maybe that rest stop saved me from something I'll never be able to name. But I still remember the exact tone of his voice. Flat, almost bored, when he mentioned the rear tire, like he wasn't giving advice or offering a warning. Just stating a fact that didn't belong to me yet. And every once in a while, when I'm on the road alone late at night and the sky feels too big and the highway feels too empty, I glance into the rearview mirror and watch for headlights that don't pass and don't fall behind. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder how thin the line really was between a strange story I get to tell and something that might never have left anyone behind to tell it. It was during the final weeks of October in 2018 when I found myself driving alone through the remote and wind-scoured highways of New Mexico, following a long stretch of road that felt more like a deserted artery cutting through the middle of nowhere than any kind of passage meant for frequent travelers. And though the trip was meant to be a casual return from a weekend visit, The hour had grown far later than I'd planned, casting the desert around me into that unnerving kind of darkness where even the horizon seems to disappear entirely. The sky above me had long faded to a dull, starless black, and the highway, narrow and without reflective barriers, stretched endlessly into that void, flanked only by dry fields, sporadic scrub brush, and the skeletal remains of old fence lines that hadn't served a clear purpose in years. With no signs of civilization and no other vehicles in sight, I was completely isolated. The faint hum of my engine and the occasional creak of my tires against the uneven asphalt becoming the only sound in that vast emptiness, until a glance at my fuel gauge startled me with the sudden realization that I had far less gas remaining than I'd assumed. The needle hovered just above empty, and though I hadn't seen a lit station for more than 30 minutes, I knew I couldn't afford to keep driving blind into the darkness, hoping for a service stop to appear on its own. I pulled up the navigation screen on my dash, which lagged slightly before revealing a small, singular marker labeled "Only Fuel," situated along a winding frontage road that branched off to the south and rejoined nothing in particular, with no named towns or intersecting highways nearby. Just a blank pocket of desert interrupted only by that one location. With no alternative and a growing sense of urgency tightening in my chest, I made the turn onto the narrow road, watching as the last of the painted lines vanished behind me and the land grew even more featureless, until at last a small cluster of lights emerged in the distance, like the glow of a match in a pitch-black room. The gas station, if it could even be called that, looked like something that had been left behind by time itself. A low-slung concrete building with a weather-beaten roof, flickering fluorescent signage, and two metal pumps that stood crooked and rusted at the base, surrounded by a gravel lot that hadn't seen maintenance in years. There was no branding anywhere, no sign of recent activity, and not a single vehicle parked in the lot or passing by on the road behind me. It was the kind of place you could easily drive past without even realizing it had been there at all. And for a moment, I sat behind the wheel, wondering if I had made a mistake by stopping. Eventually, I stepped out and began refueling, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the edge of the lot, half expecting to hear movement or see headlights coming down the road. But there was nothing. Only the distant howl of dry wind as it swept through the brush and rattled the loose metal siding of the building. Once the tank was full, I walked into the station to pay, finding the interior to be even more unsettling than the outside. The dim, yellow-tinged lighting barely illuminated the aisles, which were sparsely stocked with dusty shelves of old snack food, faded bottles of soda, and a refrigerated case that groaned and buzzed as though it had been working too hard for too long. Behind the counter stood a woman who appeared to be in her late 40s or early 50s, her face lined with quiet fatigue and her posture suggesting a kind of long-standing stillness, as if she had spent years standing in that exact position with nothing but silence for company. Though her presence was unremarkable at first glance, there was something in the way she regarded me, calm, expressionless, and strangely passive, that made the air feel thicker, like the temperature had dropped slightly the moment I stepped inside. I completed the transaction quickly and left without speaking further. But as I stepped back outside and returned to my car, I was overwhelmed by the sensation that the entire place had been waiting for me. Not out of welcome or necessity, but with the cold detachment of inevitability. I pulled back onto the highway and accelerated toward the west, the lights of the station quickly swallowed by the darkness behind me until even their faint glow had disappeared from the rearview mirror. For a while, I drove in silence, The only sounds are those of the wind buffeting the sides of the car and the quiet rhythm of the tires against the road. Then, without warning, a pair of headlights appeared behind me in the distance. Small at first, barely noticeable, but steadily growing closer until the shape of a vehicle became clear. It was a white pickup truck, boxy and older in design, possibly an early 2000s model. And though I initially assumed it would pass me on the long, open stretch of highway, it remained directly behind me, its front grille hovering uncomfortably close to my rear bumper in a way that felt less like ordinary impatience and more like deliberate pressure. After several minutes of maintaining that distance, the driver activated their high beams, which flooded the interior of my car with a sudden, blinding white light that obliterated my view of the rearview mirror and sent a jolt of adrenaline through my entire body. The high beams would remain on for several seconds before shutting off abruptly, then flaring back on again a few moments later. And this pattern repeated itself with an eerie rhythm that felt too consistent to be accidental. At first, I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps the driver believed something was wrong with my car, or maybe they were trying to get my attention to warn me about a flat tire or a loose item. But as the minutes passed and the behavior continued, those explanations began to fall apart beneath the weight of instinctive dread. Despite every rational thought urging me to slow down and at least assess the situation, to check if there was something wrong with my vehicle, or to see if the driver behind me was signaling a legitimate issue, I couldn't shake the deeper, more instinctive feeling that stopping in that moment would have been an unforgivable mistake. There was something about the way the truck stayed fixed to my rear bumper, flashing those high beams again and again with eerie consistency, that felt less like a warning and more like bait. Without fully understanding why, I knew I couldn't give it what it wanted. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my knuckles going pale, and stared straight ahead at the dark ribbon of road stretching forward, forcing myself to keep my speed steady and resisting the growing pressure to react or panic. I didn't accelerate wildly, and I didn't swerve. I simply refused to engage. I just drove, quietly, steadily, like I didn't see them at all. After what felt like the longest stretch of road I'd ever driven, maybe 10, 15 miles at most, the truck suddenly veered off the highway without signaling, turning sharply onto a barely visible dirt path that branched off into the desert scrub. There were no signs, no markers, not even tire tracks to suggest it had been used recently. Just dust and brush and open land. I caught one final glimpse of its red taillights blinking through the kicked-up dirt before they vanished behind a thicket of mesquite and low desert hills. And then it was gone. I didn't slow down. I didn't check my mirrors. I just kept driving. Eventually, the lonely two-lane road spilled into the outskirts of a small town. Nothing more than a diner, a closed hardware store, and a couple of old gas pumps beneath buzzing floodlights. But it felt like civilization after the stretch I'd just come through. I pulled into the station and parked beneath one of the lights, engine running, hands still clamped around the steering wheel, even though I was no longer moving. I didn't get out right away. I just sat there, heart pounding slowly now, eyes still scanning my surroundings out of habit. There was no one else on the road and no sign of that truck. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Not that night, not the next day. There wasn't much to say. Nothing technically happened. I hadn't seen the driver's face. I hadn't gotten a license plate. There was no confrontation, no physical threat, no actual damage. Just headlights in the dark. A strange turnoff. and a long hour of quiet, suffocating fear. It wasn't something you could easily explain to someone who hadn't experienced it. And the thought of walking into a police station to report that someone might have been trying to scare me without a single piece of proof felt ridiculous. Weeks later, I was scrolling through an old forum thread about rural travel stories, just killing time, when I stumbled across a string of posts discussing a gas station somewhere off a forgotten road in New Mexico. A few users mentioned how odd the place had felt, and one even described being given a quiet warning by a female clerk. Something vague about not stopping for anyone who tried to wave them down or flash their lights. The wording wasn't identical to what I remembered, but the tone was. And something about the way they described the setting. Lonely pumps, buzzing lights, dusty aisles, made my stomach drop. The post didn't have a name or coordinates, just a few eerie details that felt too familiar. I've never tried to find that place again. I wouldn't even know how if I wanted to. The road I took isn't one I've driven since, and I'm not sure I'd recognize it, even if I passed it again. A lot of highways out there look the same, especially at night. But to this day, I still think about what could have happened if I'd pulled over. Not in some dramatic or sensational way, but just practically. What if I'd stopped, stepped out of the car, called out to the driver to ask what was going on? What if they'd been waiting for exactly that moment? I didn't stop, and I never got an answer. But sometimes, not knowing is enough. Sometimes it's the only reason you make it home. It was during a solitary drive eastbound through the sparsely populated stretch of Interstate 70 in Utah, late in the fall of 2019, when I found myself beginning to feel the familiar discomfort of long travel. The stiffness in my knees from hours of uninterrupted driving, the dry ache at the back of my throat from recycled air, and the increasing urgency from my bladder, reminding me that it had been too long since my last stop. The road had unspooled in a straight, unbroken line across an empty desert expanse, interrupted only by the occasional rock formation or skeletal signpost pointing toward towns that barely qualified as such. And as the afternoon light began to sink lower into the sky, casting the desert into gold-edged shadows, I knew I had to find a place to stop before both the light and my patience ran out. Eventually, after another 20 minutes of driving through utter silence, I saw a faded green highway sign, partially obscured by dust and age, indicating a gas station and services just off the next exit. With little more than instinct and necessity guiding me, I took the turnoff and followed a cracked and uneven service road that curved around a low ridge and revealed a lonesome structure at the base of a hill, nestled in what felt like an accidental clearing. A place forgotten by the modern world, preserved only because no one had yet bothered to dismantle it. The gas station stood low and flat, a squat cinder block building with faded siding, a rusted awning creaking in the wind, and an old neon sign with half its letters darkened, its brand name worn away until only a few ghostly outlines remained where paint used to be. There were no other vehicles in the lot, no sign of movement at the pumps, and no indication of recent activity aside from a flickering red "open" sign that buzzed faintly in one of the grimy front windows, as if stubbornly insisting it still served a purpose. I parked my car to one side of the building, careful to avoid a wide, discolored stain in the gravel that looked like it had been there for years, and stepped out into the dry, cooling air, which carried the faint scent of scorched rubber, old gasoline, and something else I couldn't immediately identify, but which gave me pause nonetheless. Inside, the gas station was dim and quiet, lit only by a few overhead fluorescent tubes that flickered every few seconds, casting the entire interior in a rhythm of pale blue light and brief, unsettling darkness. The shelves were sparsely stocked with outdated snack food, dusty cans, and bottles that looked like they had not been touched in months, perhaps years. And the drink cooler in the back of the store buzzed with a mechanical wheeze, its glass fogged with a fine white mist that made it impossible to see what, if anything, it contained. Near the register stood a man who appeared to be in his late 50s, with a lean, sunken frame that gave the impression of someone who had once been tall, but had slowly collapsed inward over time. His hollow cheeks and discolored fingernails betraying a kind of fatigue that felt more spiritual than physical. He did not speak to me when I approached, nor did he make any effort to engage me with the usual hollow customer service pleasantries, instead glancing up only long enough to register my presence, before reaching slowly beneath the counter and producing a large, rust-streaked key attached to a brittle yellow plastic tag that was partially melted along one edge. The faded letters that once read "restroom" were barely visible beneath layers of grime and discoloration. And when I took the key from his hand, I felt an unpleasant stickiness on the underside of the tag, a residue like dried syrup or glue that made me instinctively rub my palm against the leg of my jeans as I turned away. Following a narrow side path that led away from the main building, I walked past a row of trash bins, their lids askew and contents spilling out in slow decay, and rounded the corner to find the restroom facility located in a separate concrete structure detached from the main station. A squat, windowless outbuilding with 2 metal doors, each marked by faded signs indicating gender, though the letters had mostly flaked away in the sun. The path leading to the doors was uneven and cracked, sprouting with brittle weeds that crackled beneath my shoes. And as I approached the one labeled "Men," I immediately saw something that caused me to stop mid-step and narrow my eyes in confusion. Emerging from the bottom edge of the door was a wide, sluggish puddle of dark liquid that had spread unevenly across the concrete threshold and begun soaking into the dirt beyond, forming thick, irregular veins that shimmered faintly under the dying light. At first, I assumed it might have been oil or some runoff from within the bathroom. But as I stepped closer and crouched slightly to examine it, I realized the substance was far too thick to be water and had a density that made it look more like syrup or coagulated grease. Except the color was off, almost unnatural, hovering somewhere between deep maroon and pitch black, with no discernible source visible beneath the door itself. A sharp, metallic scent drifted upward from it, carried on the slight breeze. A scent that reminded me unpleasantly of pennies and something more organic, like overripe fruit left to rot in a metal pan beneath the sun. I tried the door handle out of instinct, but the knob refused to budge more than a centimeter in either direction, as though it had been locked from the inside or was being blocked by something too heavy to move. The key I had been given did not seem to fit the lock. Or if it did, the tumblers inside were so corroded that they could no longer shift. I stood there for a while, unwilling to step closer to the dark liquid and unsure whether I should knock or simply abandon the attempt altogether, before I finally turned back toward the store to report the issue. When I returned to the counter and explained what I had seen, the locked door, the strange liquid, the overwhelming smell, The man behind the register responded, not with alarm or confusion, but with an eerie kind of resignation, as if I had just confirmed something he already knew and had been expecting. Without speaking, he reached beneath the counter once again and retrieved a second key. This one, smaller, newer looking, and attached to a blank piece of polished steel with no identifying features. He held it loosely in his fingers for several seconds, staring at it with an unreadable expression before slipping it into the pocket of his jacket and walking silently around the counter to lead the way back toward the restroom. I followed him back out into the evening light, unsure whether I should feel comforted by how calm he seemed or unnerved by it, because there was something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, and completely unreactive, that didn't suggest confidence so much as emotional detachment, the way someone might act when they've long since stopped being surprised by anything. The air outside had gone still, with no breeze to stir the weeds or rattle the worn siding of the building, and even the buzzing insects that had been present earlier seemed to have disappeared, as if the area around that little structure had been cut off from the natural rhythm of the world. All I could hear was the crunch of gravel beneath our shoes and the faint metallic groan of an old sign swinging slightly on its rusted bracket behind us. When we reached the restroom again, I saw that the dark fluid, whatever it was, had continued to spread outward across the concrete, forming irregular trails that snaked down into the dirt as like runoff from a long-forgotten industrial site. It didn't look fresh anymore, but it also didn't look like anything that had dried or congealed either. It just lingered there, stagnant and stubborn, like it was leaching from the ground itself. The man didn't approach the door. He stopped a few paces short of it and stood motionless, staring at the base as if waiting for something to happen. After a long moment, without touching the key still in his coat pocket, he slowly turned and started walking back toward the store. He didn't give me any explanation. He didn't apologize or offer another place to go. He just said the restroom was closed and that the station would be shutting down for the evening. His voice was flat, not rude, not dismissive, just tired in a way that made it clear that there wasn't going to be any further discussion. And for some reason, I didn't question it. Maybe it was the tone of his voice, or the way he refused to look me in the eye. Or maybe it was just the fact that I felt, without understanding why, that pushing for answers might not just be fruitless. It might be dangerous. I walked back to my car without saying another word, my stomach tight with unease and my thoughts scattered in 100 directions, none of which brought me any closer to understanding what I'd just seen. I didn't bother to top off the tank. I didn't check the mirror to see if he was still watching me. I just turned the ignition and pulled back onto the road, the fading red glow of the station's flickering neon sign disappearing behind me as I merged again with the highway's dark stretch of asphalt. It was a few days later, after I'd crossed into Colorado and checked into a cheap roadside motel near Rifle, that I happened to come across a short article linked in a local online forum, just a few paragraphs long, buried beneath notices about construction delays and seasonal weather warnings. The headline mentioned a gas station closure along I-70. There wasn't a photo, and the location wasn't named, but the description matched perfectly. Rural, isolated, cited for multiple health violations. The story didn't go into detail. It just said that state inspectors had ordered an immediate and indefinite shutdown, citing critical sanitation concerns and hazardous interior conditions. There were no statements from officials, no mention of an investigation, Just one closing sentence that made the hair on my arms stand up. The building will remain sealed until further notice, pending structural assessment and containment clearance. That's not how anyone talks about a clogged drain or a backed-up septic line. That's not language you use when you're dealing with rats or mildew or a broken water main. That kind of phrasing, containment and clearance, belongs in a different category altogether. The kind where nobody tells the public exactly what they found, because doing so would only raise more questions than anyone is willing to answer. I never went back. I never tried to contact anyone about what I saw. And even now, all this time later, I still don't have a clear explanation for what was behind that door or what was leaking out onto the ground. But what I do know, what I remember in the quiet moments when I let my guard down, is the way the man looked at it. Not with panic, not with fear, just exhaustion, like whatever had started back there wasn't new, and it wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Like he had been watching that door for a long time, and whatever was on the other side had never once needed to come out in order to make its presence known. It was sometime in the early part of 2022, around the beginning of spring, when I found myself driving through one of those long, uneventful stretches of rural Ohio highway, where the scenery barely changes for hours, and the road feels like it's suspended at somewhere outside of time. The landscape on either side had become a blur of skeletal trees, empty fields, and scattered remnants of towns that never quite made it past the map margins. I had been on the road since just after midnight, and although fatigue had not yet sunk its claws fully into me, I was starting to feel the weight of uninterrupted silence pressing in from every direction. The truck's engine hummed steadily beneath me, a low, comforting sound, and I decided to pull off the road at a small gas station I remembered from previous runs. An old, poorly maintained place that sat just off the shoulder of a quiet exit ramp. There was something about that gas station that always struck me as suspended in a kind of limbo, as though it hadn't aged so much as it had simply been left behind by everything else. The pumps looked old but functional. The signage was faded and peeling around the edges, and the building itself appeared almost sunken into the surrounding earth, like it had been trying to disappear quietly for years without anyone noticing. Still, it worked. It had fuel, coffee, and a restroom. And that was all I cared about at the time. The air outside was sharp and unmoving. The sky smeared in a dull steel blue haze that suggested dawn was still an hour or more away. And not a single other vehicle could be seen in any direction along the road or parked nearby. I pulled into the lot and stopped beside pump 4, cutting the engine and stepping down onto the cracked pavement. As the door thudded shut behind me, the only sounds were the quiet buzz of the overhead halogen lights and the wind brushing faintly through the dried grasses near the tree line beyond the station. Everything about the moment felt completely ordinary, and I began fueling without really paying attention. Until, while standing there with my hand on the pump handle, I noticed something just beyond the periphery of my vision that made my gaze shift instinctively. 2 pumps down, at what I remember clearly being pump 6, stood a man. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark jacket zipped up to the collar, jeans that appeared slightly worn, and scuffed shoes that were barely visible beneath the long hem of his pants. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, and he stood facing directly outward toward the road, his head tilted slightly downward as though lost in thought, or perhaps simply staring at nothing at all. At first, I assumed he had just arrived and was waiting for a ride, or that maybe he had come from a vehicle parked nearby. But that assumption quickly unraveled as I scanned the lot again and confirmed what I already knew. There was no car next to him, and no other vehicle anywhere in sight except for my own truck and a dilapidated old sedan parked askew near the far end of the lot, coated in a thick layer of dust and grime that suggested it had been abandoned some time ago. The man didn't shift his posture, didn't move his head, and didn't acknowledge my presence in any way, even though I was clearly within his line of sight. I thought maybe he was cold and keeping still to conserve heat, or that he was experiencing something internal, grief, exhaustion, or maybe even intoxication. But none of those explanations made me feel any more at ease. There was something peculiar in his stillness, something unnatural in the way his body remained fixed in place, without even the slightest weight shift or visible breath escaping into the cold air around him. He wasn't just standing there. He was frozen, anchored somehow, like he wasn't part of the living world in the way I was. Despite the growing unease curling slowly in my chest, I finished fueling and walked inside the store, hoping a few minutes under the harsh fluorescent lighting would clear my head. The interior of the convenience store was as dim and grimy as I remembered, its floor mottled with old stains and its aisles half-stocked with dusty items that looked like they hadn't been rotated or reordered in years. There was no music playing, no radio humming in the background, just the faint, uneven hum of an aging refrigerator unit near the back. I grabbed a hot cup of coffee, though I barely tasted it, and thought about the man I had seen. Something about the entire scene didn't sit right, and although I hadn't intended to strike up a conversation, I did glance toward the cashier behind the counter, a young man who looked barely old enough to be working the night shift. I mentioned the figure standing outside near the pumps, more as a way of grounding myself than out of any real concern. And while I didn't expect much of a response, I certainly wasn't prepared for the blank, indifferent look I received in return. There was no flicker of recognition, no curiosity, just a slow shake of the head, followed by a quiet insistence that I had been alone out there the entire time. Still holding the coffee in my hand, I stepped back outside, half expecting to see the figure still standing where he had been just moments before. But the space next to Pump 6 was empty now. Completely, utterly empty. There were no footprints, no vehicle, no movement of any kind. The wind had picked up slightly, whistling through the light poles and fluttering a piece of torn plastic caught in the brush at the edge of the lot, but that was the only sign of life. Whatever, or whoever, I had seen standing so eerily still beneath the harsh artificial lights had vanished without a trace, and I couldn't tell if that was more comforting or more disturbing. I climbed back into the truck and settled into the driver's seat, closing the door gently behind me as the last of the cabin's warmth began to fade into the still morning air. I didn't turn the key right away. Instead, I sat there, motionless, listening to the soft creak of the seat beneath me and the quiet ticking of the cooling engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but I wasn't gripping it. I was just staring straight ahead, eyes unfocused, while the image of that man standing at Pump 6 played over and over again in my mind. No matter how many times I tried to reinterpret it, no matter how many ways I tried to explain it to myself, I kept returning to the same conclusion. I had seen someone standing there, someone real, someone present, and now they were gone in a way that didn't make sense. I told myself it could have been a misunderstanding. Maybe I'd caught a reflection at just the right angle, or my brain, worn thin by hours of night driving, had filled in something that wasn't there. Maybe I hadn't gotten as much rest the day before as I thought. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. This hadn't felt like a moment of confusion or a quick trick of the light. It had felt solid, physical. There was a weight to what I saw. And what disturbed me the most wasn't that the man had vanished, but that his presence had felt so unmistakably real in the first place. By the time the sun had fully risen, and the road behind me had stretched far enough to feel like a clean break, I stopped at a rest area, one of those quiet, open ones, with too much concrete and too little traffic, and pulled out the memory card from my dash cam. I didn't have much hope of finding anything. Truthfully, I expected to see a blank feed, something easy to dismiss. But I needed to check, needed to know that at least one part of what I'd experienced could be backed up by something other than my memory. The rear-facing camera, which angled slightly toward the pump islands, had recorded everything clearly. There I was, stepping out of the truck, reaching for the pump, going through the usual routine. And in the background, just off-center in the frame, was the man. He was exactly as I remembered him. Tall, still, hands tucked deep into his jacket pockets, head slightly lowered. He never turned, never moved. He simply stood there, as if waiting for something that never came. But when I pulled up the footage from the forward-facing camera, the one mounted just above the dash and pointed directly toward the front of the station, the scene was different. The pumps were visible, just as they should have been. And so was the building, the cracked pavement, the hazy morning light. But the space next to Pump 6 was empty. There was no figure, no silhouette, no shadow. Just a stretch of concrete that looked untouched and utterly vacant. If I hadn't seen the other feed first, I would have had no reason to believe anyone had been there at all. I scrubbed through both videos several times, running them in parallel, pausing frame by frame to try and make sense of it. The timestamps were identical, and everything else. The way the wind stirred the trees, the subtle flicker of the pump lights, even the position of my own body, lined up perfectly between both views. Everything but him. To this day, I still don't have an explanation that sits comfortably with me. I never mentioned it to anyone at work. There's no point bringing something like that into conversation unless you're prepared to be laughed off. Or worse, quietly questioned behind your back. The footage still sits on an old external hard drive, tucked away in my drawer at home, and I haven't looked at it in over a year. But I haven't deleted it either. I haven't stopped at that station since. I pass the exit from time to time, usually during daylight hours, and every time I do, I glance in that direction without meaning to. I've never seen anyone standing there again, but that part doesn't surprise me. What stays with me more than anything else is how ordinary the moment felt until it didn't. How something so small, just a man standing still at a pump, could turn into something I still can't make sense of, even after all this time. I don't claim to know what I saw. I don't jump to labels, and I'm not interested in ghost stories or internet speculation. All I know is that I was there. I saw someone. One camera recorded him, the other didn't. And no matter how much I try to put it behind me, that detail alone is enough to remind me that sometimes, in the most mundane corners of the world, there are things that don't line up the way they should. And sometimes, they don't need to make a sound or move a muscle to stay with you. They just need to be seen once, in a place you thought you understood, to leave you questioning every moment like it that comes after.